Luigi Mangione never imagined he would one day become the centerpiece of a criminal trial that gripped the nation. Once a quiet, unassuming figure in the bustling corporate world, Mangione's name became synonymous with scandal, betrayal, and bloodshed. Accused of murdering a high-profile CEO under circumstances as shocking as they were mysterious, Mangione now stands on the precipice of ultimate justice, the death penalty. But was he truly the cold-blooded killer the prosecution painted him to be? Or was he merely a pawn in a far larger game of corporate greed and deception? This story dives deep into the shadowy corners of a world where power and ambition reign supreme. In uncovering the truth behind the murder of a powerful CEO, the line between innocence and guilt blurs, and Luigi Mangione's fate hangs in the balance. The room was eerily quiet when the cleaning staff stumbled upon the scene. The CEO's office at Phoenix Corp was a glass-walled palace overlooking the city skyline, a place of power and prestige. Now it was transformed into something macabre. The body of Robert Callahan lay sprawled across the conference table, his suit jacket rumpled, a crimson stain blooming across his chest. The metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint scent of his cologne. A toppled coffee cup on the table leaked its contents onto the floor, the dark liquid pooling in grotesque harmony with the blood. The lights were dim, set to their usual energy-saving mode, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The first responders described the scene as both chilling and surreal. A gun rested on the floor just a few feet away from Luigi Mangione, a mid-level former employee of Phoenix Corp. Mangione was slouched against the far wall, his face pale and his eyes wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked as though he had seen a ghost, or perhaps had become one himself. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he mumbled incoherent words as officers approached him. To the police, it seemed open and shut. A dead man, a weapon, and an apparent suspect. Luigi Mangione was immediately placed under arrest, his protests falling on deaf ears. He claimed he had no memory of what had happened. His words were disjointed, panicked, but he kept repeating one thing. "I didn't kill him. I don't remember anything." The media descended on the case like vultures on a carcass. News outlets splashed headlines that painted Luigi as a disgruntled former employee who had taken matters into his own hands. CEO gunned down in office, disgruntled worker in custody, read one particularly sensationalized headline. Overnight, Luigi Mangione went from an unknown name to the most reviled man in the city. But those who knew Luigi were perplexed. He wasn't a man prone to violence or outbursts. He had worked at Phoenix Corp for years without any serious disciplinary action, though his career there had ended abruptly. He was described as soft-spoken, a man who kept to himself, though his intelligence and diligence were well regarded by colleagues. When he was fired nearly a year prior to the incident, he hadn't made a scene. He'd simply packed his belongings and disappeared from the corporate world without much fuss. Detectives tasked with unraveling the case faced mounting pressure. The evidence seemed clear. Luigi's fingerprints were on the gun, and there were no signs of forced entry. Security cameras showed him entering the building late that night, well after business hours, and there was no footage of anyone else arriving after him. Yet the case didn't sit right with Detective Marisol Vega, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for digging deeper than most. The timeline was murky. According to preliminary forensic reports, Callahan had been killed around 11:15 p.m. Luigi had been spotted entering the building around 10:50 p.m. It left just enough time for him to reach the executive suite, confront Callahan, and pull the trigger. But why? The supposed motive wasn't compelling. Luigi had grievances, sure. He had claimed publicly that Callahan and the company were corrupt, even going so far as to send a few emails to regulatory bodies alleging financial improprieties. But those claims have been largely dismissed, and Luigi had no prior history of violence or erratic behavior. For him to escalate from a disgruntled employee to a cold-blooded murderer in a matter of months seemed unlikely. Marisol began piecing together Luigi's movements leading up to the night in question. Witnesses described him as withdrawn but not particularly angry. A neighbor mentioned seeing him carrying groceries into his modest apartment the evening before the murder, his demeanor ordinary. His bank statements showed no unusual activity, no signs of desperation or planning. Yet there he was, sitting in an interrogation room, his head in his hands, looking every bit the picture of guilt. Luigi's own account was bizarre and fragmented. He admitted to being in the building but claimed he was lured there by an anonymous message he had received earlier that day. The message, he said, promised information that would vindicate his claims against Phoenix Corp. and expose Callahan as a fraud. He described feeling a sense of dread as he stepped into the elevator that night, the long ride up to the executive floor filled with tension. He remembered entering the office, seeing Callahan alive and well, and then nothing. His memory was a blank slate, as if someone had wiped it clean. The detectives were skeptical. Anonymous messages and memory gaps sounded like the excuses of a guilty man. But there was something in Luigi's eyes, an earnestness, a desperation, that gave Marisol pause. She combed through the security footage frame by frame, looking for any inconsistencies. While Luigi was clearly seen entering the building, the footage showed him visibly uneasy, almost hesitant. He paused several times, glancing over his shoulder as if he thought someone was following him, but there was no one else in sight. Marisol also reviewed the autopsy report, hoping it might shed light on any details the crime scene had missed. Callahan had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the shoulder. The fatal shot had been delivered at close range, suggesting an up-close confrontation. But curiously, there were faint bruises on Callahan's wrists, as if he had been restrained at some point before his death. This detail was not consistent with Luigi's story, or the prosecution's assumption of a straightforward murder. As Marisol continued her investigation, more questions arose. Why had Callahan been in the office so late? Was he expecting someone? And if Luigi had gone there to kill him, why had he stayed at the scene, frozen in what seemed like a state of shock? The more she dug, the less certain she became about Luigi's guilt. But with the weight of public outrage and mounting pressure from her superiors to close the case quickly, Marisol knew she had little time to find the answers she needed. For Luigi Mangione, the clock was ticking, and the shadow of the death penalty loomed ever closer. Luigi Mangione sat alone in his cell, his head resting in his hands. The cold, damp air of the detention center seemed to seep into his bones, chilling him to the core. The last few days had been a blur of accusations, interrogations, and moments of stark disbelief. As he replayed the events in his mind, trying to make sense of how his life had spiraled into this nightmare, the only thing he could cling to was the notion that none of it felt real. Outside the cell, the wheels of justice, or perhaps vengeance, were already turning. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case to the public. Luigi Mangione wasn't just a former employee of Phoenix Corp, they said. He was a man driven by bitterness, consumed by a grudge against Robert Callahan. It was this grudge, they argued, that had led him to murder the CEO in cold blood. The allegations painted a grim picture of Luigi. Fired nearly a year ago after making unsubstantiated accusations against the company, he had spent months obsessing over his perceived injustices. According to the prosecution's narrative, Luigi had harbored a festering resentment that finally exploded into violence. They cited emails he had sent to colleagues and regulatory bodies, accusing Phoenix Corporators of shady practices, as evidence of his vendetta against the company and its leader. Those emails were damning on the surface. In one, Luigi wrote that Callahan and his cronies are bleeding this company dry and someone needs to stop them. In another, he claimed to have uncovered evidence of fraudulent accounting practices and insider trading. But when pressed for specifics, Luigi had been unable to provide anything concrete. The accusations had been dismissed as the rantings of a disgruntled ex-employee, and no formal investigation had ever been launched. To the prosecution, this history painted Luigi as a man with a motive. He had lost his job, his credibility, and his chance to climb the corporate ladder, all because of Callahan. But Luigi's defense team saw things differently. For them, these emails weren't proof of a murderous grudge, but evidence that Luigi had stumbled upon something dangerous. something that might have put a target on his back. Luigi's lawyer, Evelyn Torres, was a sharp and tenacious defense attorney with a knack for finding cracks in seemingly airtight cases. She believed that the real story behind Luigi's firing was more complicated than what Phoenix Corp had let on. Digging into company records, Evelyn discovered that Luigi had been terminated under peculiar circumstances. His dismissal had come shortly after he raised concerns about discrepancies in the company's financial reports. Discrepancies that, according to Luigi, hinted at large-scale fraud. Phoenix Corp owners had claimed that Luigi's allegations were baseless, a fabrication born of paranoia. But Evelyn wasn't so sure. She interviewed several of Luigi's former colleagues, and while most were reluctant to speak out, one brave soul admitted that Luigi had been onto something. This colleague, who requested anonymity, described a culture of secrecy and intimidation at Phoenix Corp. Employees who asked too many questions or expressed doubts about the company's practices were swiftly silenced, either through termination or reassignment to less critical roles. Luigi had been one of the few who refused to back down. According to the anonymous source, he had spent weeks poring over financial records and compiling what he believed was irrefutable proof of wrongdoing. When he presented his findings to Callahan, the CEO had allegedly reacted with anger and hostility, accusing Luigi of overstepping his bounds and undermining the company. Within days, Luigi was out of a job. But why would Callahan go to such lengths to discredit and silence a relatively low-level employee? Evelyn suspected that Luigi had stumbled upon something far bigger than he realized. She began looking into Callahan's personal and professional history, and what she found only deepened her suspicions. Callahan had a reputation as a ruthless businessman, a man who would do whatever it took to protect his empire. Over the years, he had faced numerous allegations of unethical behavior, from leveraging insider information to crush competitors to engaging in aggressive tax avoidance schemes. None of these allegations had ever stuck, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Callahan's success was built on more than just business acumen. The timing of Luigi's firing also raised red flags. It coincided with a period of significant upheaval at Phoenix Corp, including the sudden resignation of the company's chief financial officer, Martha LeBlanc. Officially, LeBlanc had stepped down for personal reasons, but whispers within the industry suggested that her departure had been prompted by a falling out with Callahan over undisclosed matters. Evelyn couldn't ignore the possibility that LeBlanc's resignation and Luigi's firing were connected, that both were casualties of Callahan's attempts to bury the truth. As Evelyn pieced together this puzzle, she began to see Luigi not as a vengeful killer, but as a potential whistleblower who had been caught in the crosshairs of a powerful man's schemes. But this interpretation raised its own set of questions. If Luigi had been targeted for silencing, why had he survived the night of the murder? Why hadn't the true perpetrators, if they existed, simply eliminated him along with Callahan? And if Luigi's accusations against Phoenix Corp were valid, where was the evidence to support them? Luigi himself was of little help in answering these questions. He remained adamant that he had gone to the office that night in response to an anonymous message promising information that would expose Callahan's corruption. But he had no proof of this message. It had been sent via a disposable email account that had since been deactivated. Without corroborating evidence, his story sounded more like a desperate attempt to deflect blame than a credible explanation. As Evelyn prepared for trial, she knew she faced an uphill battle. The prosecution's case was compelling, and public opinion was already stacked against her client. But she also knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, even in the face of overwhelming odds. If she could find the missing pieces of the puzzle, if she could prove that Luigi had been framed, then perhaps she could save him from the gallows. In the meantime, the question of motive continued to loom large over the case. Did Luigi Mangione truly harbor a murderous grudge against Robert Callahan, as the prosecution claimed? Or was he an unwitting pawn in a much larger conspiracy, one that reached into the very heart of Phoenix Corp's shadowy empire? The answers, Evelyn suspected, lay buried in the secrets Callahan had taken to his grave. Detective Marisol Vega sat at her cluttered desk, sifting through a growing pile of reports, photos, and notes. The The deeper she dug into the life and death of Robert Callahan, the less the case made sense. The narrative seemed too clean, too perfect: an angry ex-employee, a fatal confrontation, and a gun left at the scene. But Marisol had been on the force long enough to know that clean narratives often hid messy truths. The first cracks in the official story appeared as Marisol reviewed Luigi Mangioni's claims in detail. The anonymous email Luigi insisted had lured him to Phoenix Corp. On the night of the murder wasn't just a throwaway excuse. It was a thread that, if pulled hard enough, might unravel the entire case. Marisol requested access to Luigi's personal email records, hoping to trace the origins of the mysterious message. What she found was peculiar. The email had indeed existed, but it was sent from an untraceable burner account. Even more strangely, the account was deleted less than an hour after the message was sent. The contents of the email itself were cryptic but compelling. It promised Luigi a chance to obtain irrefutable proof of the corruption he had been chasing since his days at Phoenix Corp. "Come to the office tonight," it read. "You'll find what you need in Callahan's personal files. This is your chance to expose the truth." The email included instructions for bypassing security, which, while rudimentary, were detailed enough to suggest insider knowledge. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Luigi's presence in the building that night. Marisol's gut told her this was no coincidence. She began to suspect that Luigi hadn't been the only person manipulated that evening. Callahan himself might have been lured to the office under false pretenses. She pored over Callahan's calendar, emails, and phone records, searching for clues. While nothing obvious stood out, there were gaps in his communication on the day of his death. Windows of time when Callahan had been uncharacteristically off the grid. The more Marisol investigated, the more she became convinced that Callahan's death was tied to the very corruption Luigi had tried to expose. To understand the motives behind the murder, Marisol needed to dig deeper into Callahan's dealings. She requested access to Phoenix Corp's internal records, a move that triggered immediate pushback. Lawyers for the company cited confidentiality agreements and corporate privacy laws. But Marisol wasn't deterred. With a court order in hand, she gained limited access to Callahan's files. The documents were a labyrinth of contracts, financial statements, and encrypted correspondence. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. But Marisol's sharp eye for detail soon uncovered irregularities. Payments routed through shell companies, offshore accounts with vague descriptions, and suspicious transactions involving high-ranking executives. These findings aligned eerily with the accusations Luigi had made before his termination. One name that kept appearing in the files was Adrian Kovac, a shadowy figure with ties to international finance and a reputation for operating in legal gray areas. Kovac was known in corporate circles as a fixer, someone who could make inconvenient problems disappear. Marisol's instincts told her that Kovac might be the key to understanding the broader conspiracy surrounding Callahan's death. But finding Kovac proved to be no easy task. The man was a ghost, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Marisol contacted Interpol and other law enforcement agencies, piecing together what little was known about him. According to their records, Kovac had been linked to several high-profile corporate scandals. Though he had never been formally charged with a crime, his methods were subtle and precise, leaving little trace of his involvement. As Marisol delved into Kovac's background, she began to see a pattern. In every case he touched, there were allegations of whistleblowers being silenced, evidence disappearing, and executives walking away unscathed. It was a modus operandi that aligned disturbingly well with the events surrounding Callahan's murder. Meanwhile, Luigi's defense team uncovered additional evidence suggesting that he had been under surveillance in the weeks leading up to the crime. Evelyn Torres, his lawyer, presented Marisol with reports of unmarked cars parked near Luigi's apartment and strangers lingering around his usual haunts. Luigi himself had dismissed these incidents as paranoia at the time, but in hindsight they painted a troubling picture. Marisol cross-referenced these sightings with local surveillance footage, hoping to identify the individuals tailing Luigi. She found several clips of interest, including one showing a man in a dark suit loitering near Luigi's building. The man's face was obscured, but his behavior was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. Marisol ran the images through facial recognition software, but the results were inconclusive. Whoever this man was, he had taken great care to avoid leaving a digital footprint. As the investigation progressed, Marisol began to suspect that Luigi was not just a scapegoat, but a patsy in a larger scheme. Someone had orchestrated events to place him at the scene of the crime, knowing his history with Callahan would make him the perfect suspect. The question was, who stood to benefit from Callahan's death? The answer, Marisol realized, lay within Phoenix Corp itself. Callahan had been a controversial figure, but he was also the linchpin of the company's success. His death left a power vacuum at the top, one that several ambitious executives were eager to fill. Marisol compiled a list of individuals who might have had both the motive and the means to eliminate Callahan. At the top of the list was Nathan Greer, the company's COO and Callahan's longtime rival. Greer had clashed with Callahan on numerous occasions, often over the direction of the company. While Callahan favored aggressive expansion and high-risk investments, Greer advocated for a more conservative approach. Their disagreements were no secret, and insiders described their relationship as tense, if not outright hostile. When Marisol interviewed Greer, she found him polished and composed, a man well-versed in the art of corporate doublespeak. He expressed shock and sadness over Callahan's death, describing it as a tragic loss for the company. But beneath his measured words, Marisol sensed something colder, more calculating. Greer's alibi for the night of the murder was airtight. He had been at a charity gala attended by dozens of witnesses. Yet Marisol couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. With the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, Marisol faced mounting pressure to close the case. The public wanted a swift resolution, and her superiors were eager to declare Luigi Mangione guilty and move on. But Marisol couldn't ignore the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions that pointed to a conspiracy far more complex than anyone had imagined. As she stared at the evidence board in her office, the web of connections between Callahan, Kovacs, Greer, and Luigi began to take shape. It was a web spun from greed, ambition, and betrayal, a web that threatened to ensnare anyone who got too close. For Marisol, the challenge was clear: untangle the truth before it was buried forever. The courtroom was packed to capacity, a sea of spectators, reporters, and legal professionals buzzing with anticipation. Cameras clicked furiously as Luigi Mangione was escorted in by his legal team, his face a mask of exhaustion and anxiety. This trial wasn't just about the murder of Robert Callahan. It had become a spectacle, a defining moment in the city's history. The media dubbed it the trial of the century, and every detail, from the evidence presented to Luigi's demeanor, was scrutinized by the public. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case, painting Luigi as a disgruntled ex-employee who had allowed his bitterness to fester until it exploded in violence. District Attorney Martin Hensley, a seasoned prosecutor known for his ruthless tactics, described Luigi as a man consumed by hatred for Robert Callahan. He methodically outlined the alleged motive: Luigi's termination from Phoenix Corp, his failed attempts to expose what he claimed was corporate corruption, and the financial struggles that followed. The prosecution's opening statement was bolstered by what they claimed was irrefutable evidence. Luigi's fingerprints were on the gun, his DNA was found on the victim's clothing, and security footage placed him at the scene minutes before the murder. Hensley described these facts as an unbroken chain linking Luigi to the crime, a narrative so damning that it left little room for doubt. He concluded his opening remarks with a chilling reminder to the jury: "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a man who coldly and calculatedly took the life of one of the city's most prominent leaders. The evidence will show that he deserves the ultimate punishment." Luigi's defense team, led by Evelyn Torres, faced an uphill battle. Evelyn knew that the evidence against her client was damning, but she also believed it was incomplete. In her opening statement, she urged the jury to look beyond the surface and consider the possibility that Luigi had been framed. "The truth," she said, "is rarely as simple as it appears. My client is not a killer. He is a victim of circumstances far beyond his control, and we intend to prove it." The trial began in earnest, with the prosecution calling its witnesses, The first was a forensic expert who testified that the gun found at the scene was the murder weapon and that Luigi's fingerprints were the only ones on it. The expert also described the angle of the shots and the proximity of the shooter, creating a grim picture of the confrontation. Luigi sat silently, his hands clenched in his lap, as the jury absorbed the damning testimony. Next came the security officer who had reviewed the footage from the night of the murder. He confirmed that Luigi was the only person captured entering the building during the critical time frame. The footage showed Luigi entering the lobby, hesitating near the elevator, and eventually ascending to the executive floor. The prosecution played the footage for the jury, emphasizing Luigi's apparent nervousness as he made his way to what they described as a premeditated act of violence. Evelyn cross-examined each witness with precision, chipping away at their testimony wherever possible. She highlighted gaps in the forensic evidence, questioning why no gunshot residue tests had been performed on Luigi's hands. She also pointed out that the security footage, while damning on the surface, showed no actual interaction between Luigi and Callahan. "You're assuming my client went to the office to kill Robert Callahan," she said to the security officer. "But isn't it possible he was there for another reason?" The prosecution's star witness was an executive from Phoenix Corp., a polished and articulate man named Nathan Greer. Greer described Luigi as unhinged in the months leading up to his termination, claiming that Luigi had frequently clashed with colleagues and made wild accusations against Callahan. "He was obsessed," Greer testified. "He couldn't let go of the idea that he'd uncovered some grand conspiracy. He was dangerous." Evelyn's cross-examination of Greer was brutal. She confronted him with inconsistencies in his testimony and presented evidence suggesting that he had his own reasons for wanting Callahan out of the picture. She introduced financial documents showing that Greer stood to gain significantly from Callahan's death, including a lucrative promotion and access to restricted company accounts. "Mr. Greer," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade, "isn't it true that you had far more to gain from Robert Callahan's death than my client ever did?" Greer faltered but maintained his composure, denying any involvement in the murder. Still, his credibility was shaken, and Evelyn seized the moment to sow doubt in the minds of the jurors. She painted a picture of corporate intrigue, suggesting that Callahan's death was the result of a power struggle within Phoenix Corp., with Luigi framed as the perfect scapegoat. The defense called its own witnesses, including an expert in digital forensics who testified about the anonymous email that had lured Luigi to the office. The expert explained that the email had been sent using sophisticated methods to mask its origin, making it nearly impossible to trace. Evelyn argued that this email was the linchpin of the conspiracy against her client, evidence that he had been manipulated into being at the scene of the crime. Luigi himself took the stand, a risky move that could either humanize him to the jury or solidify their doubts. He described his time at Phoenix Corp., his concerns about corruption, and the events leading up to the night of the murder. His voice trembled as he recounted receiving the anonymous email and his decision to go to the office, hoping to find the proof he needed to vindicate himself. "I didn't kill Robert Callahan," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I went there to expose the truth, not to take a life." Under cross-examination, the prosecution attacked Luigi's credibility, pointing out the lack of evidence to support his claims of a conspiracy. They painted him as a desperate man grasping at straws, willing to say anything to avoid responsibility for his actions. But Luigi held his ground, his testimony unwavering despite the onslaught of questions. As the trial entered its final phase, both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated the strength of the evidence against Luigi, urging the jury to focus on the facts and disregard the defense's wild theories. Evelyn, in turn, implored the jury to consider the larger picture, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, and the possibility that Luigi was being used as a pawn in a much larger game. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a tense and uneasy silence. For Luigi, the wait was agonizing. His fate now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, their decision poised to determine whether he would walk free or face the ultimate punishment. As the hours stretched into days, the question hung heavy in the air. Would justice prevail, Or would the truth be buried alongside Robert Callahan? The courtroom was eerily silent as the jury filed back into the room, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their decision was palpable, a tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Luigi Mangione sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. His lawyer, Evelyn Torres, leaned close and whispered something meant to reassure him, but Luigi barely heard it. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it drowned out all other sounds. The judge asked the jury foreman to rise and deliver the verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a solemn demeanor, cleared his throat and looked directly at the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Luigi Mangione." He paused, the room collectively holding its breath. "Not guilty of first-degree murder." For a moment, there was no reaction. The words hung in the air as if the world itself had frozen. Then a ripple of emotion spread through the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers erupted from the spectators. Evelyn's hand gripped Luigi's arm tightly, her face breaking into a rare smile. Luigi's own reaction was delayed. His mind struggled to process the words. Not guilty. He was free, but the victory felt incomplete. Luigi knew that while the jury had spared him from the death penalty, the truth behind Robert Callahan's murder remained elusive. Someone had orchestrated this elaborate scheme, and while Luigi had escaped their trap, they were still out there, unscathed and unexposed. The prosecution's case had unraveled during the trial, largely due to Evelyn's relentless efforts to introduce doubt into the narrative. She had succeeded in painting a picture of corporate intrigue and manipulation, one that made it plausible Luigi was a scapegoat. However, she hadn't been able to definitively prove who had killed Callahan or why. Without those answers, the shadow of the crime still lingered. As the courtroom cleared out, journalists swarmed Luigi, their cameras and microphones thrust into his face. They shouted questions, demanding to know how he felt, whether he planned to take legal action against Phoenix Corp, and what his next steps would be. Luigi, overwhelmed and visibly shaken, said nothing. Evelyn shielded him as best she could, guiding him toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the streets were lined with protesters, reporters, and onlookers. Some held signs declaring Luigi's innocence, while others branded him a killer who had gotten away with murder. The cacophony of shouting voices and flashing cameras was deafening. Evelyn managed to get Luigi into a waiting car, and they sped away from the chaos. In the days that followed, Luigi struggled to adjust to his newfound freedom. The public's opinion of him remained divided. While some saw him as a victim of a corrupt system, others viewed him as a murderer who had slipped through the cracks of justice. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, his name and face plastered across newspapers, television screens, and social media feeds. Strangers whispered about him, their stares heavy with judgment or pity. Evelyn advised him to lay low, but Luigi couldn't rest. He knew that the only way to truly clear his name was to uncover the real story behind Callahan's murder. He began piecing together everything he had learned during the trial, hoping to find a thread he could follow. His investigation led him back to the anonymous email that had lured him to the office that night. Evelyn's forensic expert had been unable to trace its origin, but Luigi was determined to try again. He reached out to a former colleague from Phoenix Corp, a tech-savvy programmer named Erica, who had always been skeptical of the company's practices. Erica agreed to help, albeit reluctantly. She was wary of getting involved, knowing the risks of crossing whoever was behind Callahan's death. Together, they began analyzing the email, looking for any clues that might have been overlooked. What they found was subtle but significant. Hidden in the email's metadata was a string of characters that seemed meaningless at first glance. However, Erica recognized it as a code used in encrypted communications, a code she had seen before in internal Phoenix Corp notice correspondence. It was a small but crucial piece of evidence suggesting that the email had originated from within the company. Encouraged by this breakthrough, Luigi and Erica continued digging. They discovered a trail of encrypted messages exchanged between Phoenix Corp and Osonder's executives in the weeks leading up to Callahan's death. The messages were fragmented and difficult to interpret, but they hinted at growing tensions within the company. Phrases like "contain the fallout" and "eliminate the risk" appeared repeatedly, suggesting that Callahan had become a liability. One name stood out among the correspondence: Nathan Greer. Luigi wasn't surprised. Greer had been a central figure in the trial, and Evelyn had exposed his potential motive for wanting Callahan dead. But the messages also mentioned another name, Adrian Kovacs. This was a name Luigi hadn't encountered before, but Erica recognized it immediately. Kovacs was a notorious figure in corporate circles, known for his ability to solve problems discreetly. If Kovacs had been involved, it meant the conspiracy went far deeper than Luigi had imagined. Determined to confront Greer, Luigi began tracking his movements. He discovered that Greer had been unusually reclusive since the trial, avoiding public appearances and delegating his responsibilities at Phoenix Corp to subordinates. Luigi managed to corner him at a private club one evening where he demanded answers. Greer, visibly shaken by Luigi's presence, denied any involvement in Callahan's murder. But his denials rang hollow. When Luigi mentioned Kovacs, Greer's face paled, and he quickly ended the conversation, retreating into the club's inner sanctum. It was clear to Luigi that Greer knew more than he was letting on, but extracting the truth would be no easy task. As Luigi delved deeper, he found himself drawn into a dangerous game. He received anonymous threats warning him to abandon his investigation, and on more than one occasion, he felt the unsettling sensation of being followed. Yet he refused to back down. He had come too far to stop now. Eventually, Luigi uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, a transaction record showing a substantial payment from Phoenix Corp to an offshore account linked to Adrian Kovacs. The payment had been made just days before Callahan's death, labeled as a consulting fee. To Luigi, this was proof that Kovacs had been hired to orchestrate the murder and frame him for the crime. Luigi brought his findings to Evelyn, who agreed to present them to law enforcement. With this new evidence, the case against Kovacs and Phoenix Corp began to take shape. The revelation sent shockwaves through the corporate world, leading to multiple arrests and a federal investigation into Phoenix Corp's practices. For Luigi, the road to vindication was long and fraught with peril, but in the end he emerged as more than just a man who had narrowly escaped the death penalty. He became a symbol of resilience in the fight for justice in a world where power often seemed to overshadow truth. The real story of Robert Callahan's murder was finally exposed, and with it, Luigi Mangioni's name was cleared, not just in the eyes of the law but in the court of public opinion.